So, while I'm opening my document, I'll give you a little anecdote about how I came to this topic. Of course, as you probably guessed, I'm a great enthusiast about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And when I was in doctoral school, just because I was interested in Tolkien linguistics, I was looking for sources, for my own continued edification. And a friend of mine said, there's a book that you should look at. It's got some unique linguistic information called The Road Goes Ever On. And I said, oh, great, that'll help me in my studies. And so I did some more research on it, and I saw that there was a subtitle afterwards that said, The Road Goes Ever On, a song cycle. And immediately I said, I'm looking for a dissertation topic. Has anyone written on this yet? And so I got into WorldCat, and no one had. And so I went to my supervisor that day and said, I found it. And oh, goodness, it's been 4 years now. And now I have this lecture recital and my doctorate. So let's get started. The Road Goes Ever On, a song cycle, is a collection of art songs by composer Donald Swann, musical settings of poems by author J.R.R. Tolkien. This evening, we'll survey the life of the composer and the author, discuss the history of the cycle's composition and publication, explore the pronunciation of the Elvish poetry included among the song texts, and examine interpretive and musical considerations relevant to the cycle's performance. My goal for this project has been to increase interest in the classical music community, both in this cycle and in the compositions of Donald Swann in general. And I also hope that my research into the pronunciation of Tolkien's Elvish languages will encourage performance of both this and other examples of Elvish vocal repertoire and inspire composers to create new musical settings of texts in Tolkien's Elvish languages. Donald Ibrahim Swann was a Russian-Welsh composer and musical performer, writing predominantly vocal piano music. He's best known for his partnership with Michael Flanders, with whom he traveled the world as part of a comedic musical duo called Flanders and Swann. But he also composed a vast body of classical music, including operas, song cycles, and choral and instrumental works, most of which are relatively unknown to both his dedicated fan base and in the classical community, as they're a bit overshadowed by his popular music. Donald Swann was born in Llanelli, Wales on September 30th, 1923, to Dr. Herbert Swann and Nagwime Swann. His family had immigrated to England in 1920 to escape the violence of the Russian Revolution, and in 1925 they moved from Wales to London so that Dr. Swann could open his own medical practice closer to the Russian expatriate community. Now, the Swanns, going back several generations, were great appreciators of classical music, and Donald's parents had encouraged him to pursue his own musical endeavors. He began private piano lessons at age 6, and within a few years, he was accompanying what he called his mother's gypsy songs from her home in what's now Turkmenistan. And he was writing his own original compositions from age 8. Later, he studied composition and piano with instructors from the Royal College of Music, under whom he claimed to have reached the peak of his technical proficiency. Swann was turned down, however, for formal musical study upon entering Oxford in 1941, and so instead he took up language study, focusing on Russian. However, he had developed an appreciation for West End-style revue music, and so he had begun accompanying and writing musicals with other Oxford students, and this had also happened while he was, before he entered into college, or into university. Now, while serving as an ambulance driver and Greek interpreter in the Friends Ambulance Unit in World War II, he came into contact with Greek culture and folk music, which profoundly impacted his musical philosophy and style. He incorporated a lot of elements of Greek folk music into at least a period of his compositional style. And upon returning to his studies at Oxford, he decided to submit some of his revue songs to West End impresario Laurier Lister. Lister served as Swann's doorway to a successful career as a composer and accompanist for various West End musicals and revue shows. And he'd also begun to work with an old schoolmate, Michael Flanders. Swann's musical settings of Flanders lyrics proved to be very popular, and they began a show performing their own sort of comedic revue-style music interspersed with semi-improvised banter, which they called At the Drop of a Hat. That show and the names Flanders and Swann soon became household names in England, and they toured the world between 1956 and 1967 to great success. Now, despite the popularity of Donald Swann's Flanders and Swann compositions, which he seemingly jokingly called middlebrow, he still sought other musical genres to satisfy his creative impulses. And so he set to music the texts of poets, both modern and ancient, in various languages. He preferred vocal art songs with piano accompaniment. He also composed musical theater shows and even an opera with a libretto adapted from C.S. Lewis's novel Perelandra. It was in 1965 that Swann met the author J.R.R. Tolkien after having set several poems from his novel The Lord of the Rings to music. This was the beginning of a lifelong friendship between the two. Although Swann's busy schedule and frequent travel prevented them from remaining in close proximity, they wrote to one another often and stayed in touch until Tolkien's death in 1973. By the 1967 American tour of the Hat shows, Swann felt that his partnership with Flanders had run its course, and so while they could have continued to work successfully together and earned a lot of money, Swann kind of foresaw the stagnancy of his creative impulses as a result, and so they parted ways and remained friends until Flanders' death in '75. The remaining decades of Swann's life were spent traveling the world, performing his works with other renowned musicians of both classical and theatrical backgrounds, composing works that ran the gamut from sacred to secular, highbrow to low, vocal, choral, and orchestral, and in a wide variety of languages and styles. Donald Swann succumbed to cancer in 1994, working until nearly his last days on new compositions, concert tours, and recordings. Now, let's talk about Tolkien just a little bit. I imagine most of you are fairly familiar with Tolkien, but we'll go over his life just a little bit. Tolkien was a South African colonial British subject. He spent most of his professional life as a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University, but he's most widely known as the author of the best-selling fantasy novels The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, called Ronald by his family, apparently never Ronald, was born to Arthur Reuel Tolkien and Mabel Suffield Tolkien on January 4th, 1892, in what is now South Africa. His parents were British subjects living in the Orange Free State to facilitate Arthur's banking career, where they had two sons, Ronald and Hilary, born in 1894. Mabel took the boys to England to see her parents in 1895, while Arthur stayed behind to manage some business affairs, intending to follow shortly after. However, he fell suddenly ill with rheumatic fever and died a few months later in early 1896. At this point, Mabel decided to remain in England, close to her family who lived in Birmingham. She moved with her sons to a nearby village called Sarehole, and this rural English village would provide Tolkien with much of the inspiration for what would become the Shire as portrayed in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. She educated her boys herself to save money, teaching them math and reading botany, which Tolkien was particularly interested in, art, and foreign languages, another area in which Ronald excelled. He especially enjoyed Latin and German. He says he didn't like French much. It didn't suit his linguistic aesthetics. He and his cousins invented languages as a game, two of which were called Animalic, and another one called Nevbosh. And the first one was essentially just substituting animal names for various words, and the second one meant new nonsense and was a modification of the first. Mabel also began attending a local Catholic church into which she was received in 1900. Now, this prompted the majority of her fairly anti-Catholic family to cut off ties with her, which worsened her already difficult financial situation. One of the more sympathetic Tolkien uncles agreed to help pay for Ronald's tuition to King Edward's Grammar School in Birmingham, where the Tolkiens moved in 1901. There they met Father Francis Morgan, who was a priest at the Birmingham Oratory, who became a very close friend to the family. Unfortunately, Mabel succumbed to diabetes, passing in 1904. Now, this had a profound effect on Ronald's outlook on life, and especially his relationship with the church. He saw his mother as a martyr, staying true to her Catholic faith despite her family's withholding of aid even during her illness, and he resolved that day to honor her sacrifice in his own lifelong devotion to the Catholic Church. The Tolkien boys were placed under the guardianship of Father Francis, who sent them to live with a nearby family in his parish, the Faulkners. There they met Edith Bratt, whom Tolkien would later marry. She was also an orphan lodging with the Faulkners, and a romance soon blossomed between her and Ronald until it was stifled by Father Francis, who was concerned that a relationship would interfere with Ronald's studies. And he may have been right, because Tolkien failed his first scholarship exam to Oxford. But Tolkien threw himself into his work at school, almost always listed at the top of his class. He especially enjoyed the study of foreign languages, and he picked up a fascination with Middle English and Old English, the languages of Chaucer and of Beowulf. Tolkien successfully won an exhibition, a smaller financial award than a scholarship, in his second attempt, and ended up studying classics at Oxford in 1911. But he found that the history of Greek and Latin and their literature didn't really interest him nearly as much as the study of Germanic languages such as Old Norse, Gothic, and Old English. He also became profoundly interested in philology, which is a subfield of linguistics nowadays. It's somewhat an old-fashioned term, I believe. He switched to English studies at the prompting of his professors, focusing on Middle and Old English and linguistics. Tolkien first encountered the Finnish language while he was at university in Oxford, and he began to create an artificial language based on Finnish, which would later become known as Quenya, one of the Elvish languages of the Lord of the Rings. Shortly after, he began composing poems and stories in or including terms from this artificial language that he was creating. And these stories and poems formed the sort of earliest seeds of what would later become what's called his legendarium, any of the stories that are set in the world of Middle-earth. When he turned 21 and was no longer under the guardianship of Father Francis, he wrote to Edith Bratt that night, asking her to marry him. Unfortunately, she was already engaged, but eventually, after some convincing, broke it off in favor of becoming engaged to Ronald. She also agreed to convert to Catholicism, despite her lodgers also being fairly anti-Catholic, and she had to move in with a cousin while Ronald finished school. After graduating from Oxford in 1915, Tolkien enlisted in the British Army to fight in World War I. Tolkien and Edith married in March of 1916, partially so that they could be housed together during Tolkien's military training. Later that year, Tolkien was deployed to France as a communications officer. Many of Tolkien's close friends from King Edward's and from Oxford died during the war, and Tolkien's own experiences during the war were profound and life-changing, and finding their way into his depiction of war in his fiction, though Tolkien always denied any direct references or any allegory in his works. He contracted trench fever in October and was sent to hospitals in England for much of the rest of his deployment. He returned to England in November of 16 and remained there until his discharge in 1920. Soon thereafter, Tolkien took up a position as an English professor at Leeds University and found work as a researcher and editor of the Oxford English Dictionary. I believe he covered words beginning with W. In 1925, he returned to his alma mater as a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University. It was here that he met C.S. Lewis and became part of the informal literary club known as the Inklings, which included the likes of Charles Williams and Owen Barfield, etc. While grading papers at some point in the 1930s, Tolkien was bored and distracted and just did not want to be grading papers at that moment, which those of us who are professors, I think we can identify a little bit. And he just wrote on the back of an essay paper that was blank, he wrote, "In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit." This meant nothing to him. But in his attempt to find out what it meant, this one phrase grew into stories that he told his children and eventually into the novel that provided the world with our introduction to Middle-earth, first published almost exactly 80 years ago. The sequel to The Hobbit incorporated much more of the mythos that Tolkien had been constructing around his artificial languages since his years as a student in Oxford. And this became one of the most widely read novels of the 20th century, The Lord of the Rings, of course, published as 3 volumes between 1954 and 1955. Tolkien led a successful and influential career as a scholar of Old and Middle English language and literature, while also writing the novels that became the foundation for the modern high fantasy literary genre, establishing himself as a household name across the world. He also spent the rest of his life editing and expanding the legends and history of his fictive world, his legendarium. But due to frequent changes in his conceptual framework and narratives, he wouldn't live to see it published. That task fell to his son and literary executor, Christopher Tolkien, who edited and published his father's somewhat incomplete works as The Silmarillion in 1977. Tolkien died in 1973 and was buried next to his wife, who had passed 2 years earlier. On their headstone was carved the names Beren and Luthien, the names of the 2 great loves of his mythos. There's a fly. All right, now, let's actually talk about the cycle a little bit. The Road Goes Ever On consists of 9 songs composed over 13 years, with later entries to the cycle added in the 2nd and 3rd editions. The songs are The Road Goes Ever On, Upon the Hearth the Fire is Red, In the Willow Meads of Tasadanan, In Western Lands, Namadie, I Sit Beside the Fire, Errantry, Bilbo's Last Song, and Luthien Tinuviel. The texts are mostly English, with 2 songs having substantial amounts of text in Quenya and Sindarin, and other songs making mention of places or characters with Elvish names. Songs 1 through 6 were composed in early 1965 while the Swann family vacationed in Ramallah near Jerusalem. Swann met Professor Tolkien in May of that year and played the songs for both him and Edith in their home. Now, Tolkien was enthusiastic about this cycle, with the exception of Song 5, set to the Elvish text Namadie. That's Galadriel's farewell. The professor said that he had pictured that text sung differently by Galadriel in that scene, and then he hummed a Gregorian plain chant melody. So Donald Swann, who had a mind like a steel trap for musical themes, took that theme and put it down into his cycle as a chant. It's the only song in the cycle that's even remotely close to that style. So Donald Swann credits Professor Tolkien with both the words and the music of Song 5 of this song cycle, which I think is cool. So, the first public performance of the cycle occurred on May 7th, 1966, as part of the Lyric Songs of Donald Swann, a program including several collections of the composer's art songs. Swann performed The Road Goes Ever On with Scottish baritone William Elvin. Yes. Tolkien said that his name was a good omen. Swann added the song Errantry, song number 7, to the song cycle after deciding that the collection needed a more upbeat ending. So he'd actually encountered this poem a number of years ago and decided that it was great for a song setting, but he hadn't known at first that it was by Tolkien because a number of copies of this had kind of circulated around, and not all of them attributed Tolkien the authorship. He brought it to Tolkien when he found out who it was by, and Tolkien expressed his concern that the poem's length and complex rhyme scheme might prove too challenging for Donald Swann to set to music. So, challenge accepted. By December of 1966, Swann played the completed song to Tolkien's enthusiastic approval. Now, interestingly, although the rhyme scheme is very multi-layered and complex, the rhythmic meter is the same as that used by Gilbert and Sullivan for Major General Stanley's Pater aria. There was a merry messenger, a passenger, a mariner. He built a gilded gondola to wander in and had in her a load of yellow oranges and porters for his provender. He perfumed her with marjoram and cardamom and lavender. I'm not a bass. The song cycle, songs 1 through 7, was published in the U.S. in the U.S. in 1967 and in the UK in 68. It included a foreword by Swann, the music of the song cycle, and a notes and translation section that provided background material for some of the poems, as well as translations of the pronunciations and notes for the Elvish texts. The pages and the cover were also decorated with Elvish calligraphy provided by Professor Tolkien. In 1967, Caedmon Records produced poems and songs of Middle-earth on vinyl, which included Swann and Elvin performing the song cycle, songs 1 through 7, and on the reverse, poetry read by Professor Tolkien himself. Now, in 1973, at Professor Tolkien's funeral, Joy Hill, who was a longtime friend, of the Tolkien family and served as their secretary for quite some time, gave Donald Swann a copy of the poem Bilbo's Last Song, which Professor Tolkien had bequeathed to her, the copyright. Swann was so inspired by the poetry of that song, or I'm sorry, by that poetry, that he set it to music that day. Bilbo's Last Song was included as Song 8 of the second edition of the cycle, published in 1978. Swann also rewrote the foreword for this new edition and added what he called choral embroideries to songs 5 through 8, which were included alongside the vocal melody line. So if you ever want to get a group together and sing them, there you go. In 1977 and/or 8, Swann also composed the song Luthien Tinuviel, setting a poem from the Silmarillion. Now, partially due to copyright conflicts over the source text, the song went unpublished until an attempt was made in 1993 to include it in a German edition of the song cycle. Now, this is interesting because this information isn't even included in the actual third edition of the song cycle, but the German publishers lacked the facilities to make a printing of any of the new music. Thus, Luthien Tinuviel went unpublished until years after Swann passed away. The song cycle, or the song, appeared in a collection of Swann's art songs in '98 and was then included in a third edition of the song cycle, which came out in 2002. This new edition included an introduction written, okay, now, this was weird when I figured this out too. This new edition also included an introduction written by Leon Berger, archivist of the Donald Swann Archive, and of no relation to me. I was just as surprised as anyone else in here to find out his name. As well as an English translation of the foreword to the 1993 German edition. Now here's the interesting part. In that English translation of the German foreword, it mentions that Luthien Tinuviel was included in the German edition, but that's not true. When Swann wrote that foreword in English, he thought they were going to be able to put it into that edition. But when they translated it into German, they had to change it from, it has been included in this edition, to, I hope that my German publishers will be able to add it later as an insert, which never happened. And so, now you know. Does anyone know how I'm doing on time? Elaine? 8 o'clock. Okay, I've got to move quickly. So, let's talk a little bit about Elvish pronunciation, shall we? In many universities and conservatories in English-speaking countries, classical singers spend a good part of their training learning how to pronounce Italian, French, German, and even English correctly. Now, this training is necessary to increase the authenticity of these performances of vocal repertoire in languages foreign to the singer, to eliminate regionalisms in their own native languages, or to conform to principles used for stage performance or recitation. This is called lyric diction, and most singers are taught to use the International Phonetic Alphabet in order to facilitate accuracy of pronunciation and ease of study. Tolkien left behind resources discussing the grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation of his artificial languages, which have been the topic of study and research by numerous linguists for decades. I used the resources at my disposal to not only create IPA transcriptions for the Elvish song texts of this cycle, of which you have samples in your handouts, but also to begin a comprehensive system of guidelines for the pronunciation and IPA transcription of any song text in either Quenya or Sindarin. This is meant to be the foundation of a system of Elvish lyric diction. Song 5, Namarie, is set to Galadriel's farewell lament in Lorien and found in the Fellowship of the Ring. The language of this text is Quenya, which Tolkien based in part on Finnish with additional influence from various Romance languages, Germanic languages, and Greek. It was used mostly as a language of literature, ceremony, and record by the elves of Middle-earth. Tolkien described it as having a function similar to that of Latin in medieval Europe. Now, unfortunately, because I've waxed so poetically about other things, I'm going to have to move things along a little bit. So rather than tell you all of these wonderful findings that I have about specifics of lyric diction, I'm just going to pronounce the text for you, and if you're interested, we can answer questions during the Q&A. So take a look at your handouts. I will now recite the full text of Galadriel's farewell lament. I, Laure lantar lassi suurinen, jeni velinte juldar avanier mioro mardi lisse miruvoreva, andune pella vardo tellumar nulluini jassen, tintilari ieleni omario aretari lirinen. Si mani jul maninen quantuva, ansi tintalle varda oeolosseo vefagnar maria telentari ortane, ar ilie tie rundullave lumbule, ar sindan orjello kaita mornie I falmalinna rimbemet, ar hisie untupa kalakirio miri oiale. Si vanwana, Rommello vanua Valimar, Namarie, nai hiruvalje Valimar, nai elje hiruva, Namarie. Song 6, I Sit Beside the Fire, includes a hymn sung by the elves of Rivendell in the Fellowship of the Ring, A Elbereth Gilthoniel. The language of this text is Sindarin, which Tolkien based largely on Welsh. This language was the daily speech of most elves of Middle-earth. Again, we're going to have to skip the specifics of pronunciation and lyric diction, but I will now read the poem A Elbereth Gilthoniel as included in the song I Sit Beside the Fire. You have the entire poem for this one. A Elbereth Gilthoniel, silivren penna miriel menelaglar elenath, na chaired palandiriel o galavremmi nennorath, fanuilos lelinnathon nevaiar si nevaiaron. Time? We're going to talk a little bit about the music, and then we'll go ahead and... Swann attributed much of his early musical influence to the folk music sung by his mother, and to the European classical repertoire he heard and played with his father and his uncles. His early introduction to four-hand piano reductions of Russian composers established a strong appreciation for European art music, and piano lessons from age 6 gave him a strong theoretical and technical foundation. However, Swann later expressed frustration with the difficulty of more advanced classical piano repertoire, which led to his seeking out participation in musicals and revue-style shows as a means of musical expression, as well as to the development of his own unique musical idiom, which combined elements of folk music, revue, and classical styles. Now, The Road Goes Ever On demonstrates influence from all of these varied genres, such that it's difficult to make statements that characterize the cycle as a whole, stylistically speaking, because many of these art songs take influence from his folk and revue backgrounds, but also include examples of Catholic plain chant, as I described earlier, as well as some of the lyrical ballad styles that he would include in some of his musical reviews. Most entries in the cycle, for example, have a relatively simple piano accompaniment, but Song 8, Errantry, is an example of extreme virtuosity on the part of the pianist. So rather than try and make broad statements about the cycle as a whole, I'm going to focus on discussing a few performance considerations and a few of the compositional characteristics in the collection. Swann emphasized the importance of text delivery in this cycle, and indeed for all of his vocal music. He felt very strongly that his compositional process was tied to the text that he said and serviced the communication of its message. Swann advised performers of the cycle to give maximum clarity to the words, not too much bel canto, sing as if to explain. And in my opinion, this should be interpreted as a warning not to prioritize perfect legato line of resonance at the expense of clear pronunciation. The poems were recited by several different characters in widely varying settings within the context of the stories that they were drawn from. Despite this frequent shift of perspective within the original source text, Swann later described his conception of the soloist as portraying Bilbo Baggins, relating accounts of his and his friends' journeys before coming to the end of his own road in Valinor. I believe that different interpretations are possible and equally valid. The depiction of individual characters of the journey of the novel, or the singular character of the journey of the song cycle, distinct from the original texts. The composer himself left such questions of characterization and interpretation entirely to the discretion of each singer. We'll now examine some of the varied elements, textures, and musical features used by Swann in the course of the song cycle. So, one of the musical textures or styles that he used was, I call lyrical ballad style, with some influence from theatric stylistic elements, such as extensive tremolo and doubling of the vocal melody. We're going to look at example 1 from song number 8, Bilbo's Last Song. He would also use text painting in the piano accompaniment, representing characters in the story, such as in Song 3, in the Willow Meads of Tassarenan. Bill is going to Dr. Femister is going to demonstrate for us a reference to the blowing of leaves in the wind. Now, most of Donald Swann's compositional idiom was very solidly tonal, but occasionally he would use extended chromaticism and parallelism to give his music a little bit of flavor or demonstrate things like wandering or being lost, especially in Song 1 of this song cycle, which Dr. Femister will demonstrate in example 3. Now, of course, he studied extensively folk music from various traditions. As I said, his mother was from what's modern Turkmenistan, and he was very well acquainted with Greek folk music, Russian folk music, English folk music, and would occasionally use modal melodies. The opening melody of Song 1 can occasionally be interpreted as Mixolydian Mode, which Dr. Femerster will demonstrate with example 4. So that bum, 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 bum is our Mixolydian mode. It's major with a flat 7. It can be interpreted either as existing in a dominant tonality or in this modal tonality here. That's all we've got time for our lecture this evening. I'm now going to take some questions. And because we're recording, I'm going to kind of repeat and rephrase any question asked of me so that everybody can hear what's being asked in case anybody has a hard time. So let's begin. Any questions? Yes.
So noting your typically open vowel choice in the IPA transcription, other than recordings that we have of Tolkien speaking this poetry, this Elvish language, were there any linguistic principles that govern your choices?
Yes, and it's funny that you mentioned those recordings because we actually have a recording of Tolkien chanting that chant as he chanted it to Swann. And he did it like 15 years or so before he chanted it to Donald Swann. It's the same melody even, so we think that it must be something that he actually heard. But at some point while the song cycle was being prepared for performance, Tolkien wrote a letter to Donald Swann saying that essentially he wanted the character of the vowels to mirror those of Italian. And so he even, I wish we could have talked about it a little bit more, but the vowels used in Quenya are actually very, very close in their execution to the vowels of Italian. You've got your open and closed E's, your open and closed O's. Long E's are closed, short E's are open. Long O's are closed, short O's are open. And again, that characterization of all the vowels as Italian led me to use that open, bright ah rather than a darker ah. Anyone else? Yes?
I had some questions about the translation work. Did you do the translation work?
I did not. I had to condense this and there were citations, but that's all actually Tolkien's work there.
So you have the actual translations for all of them?
Oh, yes. Yes, we do. If you're interested in more information, my email is down there. I'd be happy to send you more information or send you a copy of my dissertation if you're really feeling masochistic. I am so sorry, I didn't, okay. That last question was about who performed the translations of these Elvish texts, of these Elvish poetry. And as I said, this is Tolkien's work. So something not all of you may know, I mentioned that the Elvish languages actually came first, and then he started creating poetry and stories that included these languages or were even written in these languages. But Tolkien didn't make these languages to make his world seem more real in his novels. It was the other way around. He created the world and the legends of Middle-earth to make his languages feel more real to him. So these languages were art to him. They were his artistic expression, as much as writing a symphony was to Beethoven or writing an art song was to Gerald Finzi. This was his symphony. Yes? So the text of number 9, Luthien Tinuviel, that comes from the Silmarillion. It's from the tale of Beren and Luthien, And what's happening is Beren has taken himself to the stronghold of Morgoth because he has to go and take a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown, the 3 holy jewels that Morgoth stole and placed in his crown, the most valuable jewels in the world. And the father of his beloved said, "Bring me one of those jewels from the crown of the most evil, most powerful being in the world." And he said, "Wow, Elvish kings sell their daughters cheap. Here I go." So he's about to go in there, and he's suddenly doesn't have quite as much bravado, and he realizes that he may be about to die. And so the poetry that you're going to hear me sing tonight is basically him saying, even if I die, even if the whole world were to fall apart and be cast back into the abyss, it was worth it because Luthien Tinuviel was here. Anything else? Okay. Seeing no other questions, I think it's time for about a 10-minute intermission, and then we will perform The Road Goes Ever On. Thank you.
Until the stars are all alight, and world behind and all ahead, we'll wander back to and meat and bread, and then to bed, and then to bed. In western lands beneath the sun, the flowers may rise in spring, the trees may bud, the waters run, the merry finches sing. Or there may be 'tis cloudless night, and swaying beeches bare, the elven stars as jewels white amid their branching hair. Oh, here at journey's end I lie in darkness very deep, beyond all towers strong and high, lassi surinen. Vidi uno che me verrà maraldarom, vidi vedente udara varie, io romardi disse mi du voleva. Andune bella, farlo marmuluni assentintilar, iederio mario aretari dirinem. Si mani julmaninen quanto va, Varna, oioloseo, ve fagnar maria telentari ordine, arilieti erundulave lumbule, arsindanori e loccai tammorni e di falmalinari invemet, artisie un tupa calachirio nidio e ale, si vamuana romello vanno a valimar, namarie, nai valie valimar, nai hiruva, namarie. There was a merry passenger, a messenger, a mariner, built a gilded gondola to wander in, and had in her a load of yellow oranges and orange forest provender. He perfumed her with cardamom and marjoram and lavender. Seized 2 cargoes in to carry him across the river 17 that lay between. To tarry him, he landed all in loneliness, where stonily the pebbles on the running river Darrell and go merrily forever on. He journeyed then through meadowland to shadowland that dreary lay, and under hill and over hill went roving still a weary way. He sat and sang a melody, his errantry a tarrying. He begged a pretty butterfly that fluttered by to marry him. She scorned him and she scoffed at him. She laughed at him unpitying. So long he studied wizardry and sigildry and spinning. He wove a tissue, anything to snare in, to follow her. He made him beetle leather wing and feather wing of swallow hair. He caught her in bewilderment with filament of spider thread. He made her soft pavilions of lilies and a bridal bed of flowers and of thistledown to nestle down and rest her in, and silken webs of filmy white and silver light he dressed her in. He threaded gems and necklaces, but recklessly she squandered them and fell to bitter quarreling. Then sorrowing he wandered on, and there he left her withering, a shivering. He fled away, with windy weather following, on swallow wing he sped away. He passed the archipelagos where yellow grows the marigold, where countless silver fountains are and mountains are of fairy gold. He took to water foraying, a harrying beyond the sea, and roaming over Pelmerie and fantasy. He made a shield and morion of coral and of ivory, a sword he made of emerald, and terrible his rivalry, with elven knights of airy and fairy, with paladins that golden hair and shining eyed came riding by and challenged him. Of crystal was his habergeon, his scabbard of chalcedony, with silver tipped at plenty, his spear was hewn of ebony, his javelins were of malachite and stalactite. He brandished them and went and fought the dragonflies of paradise and vanquished them. He battled with the Dumbledores, the Hummerhorns and honeybees, and won the golden honeycomb, and running home on sunny seas in ship of leaves and gossamer, with blossom for a canopy, he sat and sang and furbished up and burnished up his panoply. He tarried for a little while in little isles that lonely lay, and found them not but glowing grass. And so at last the only way he took, and turned, and coming home with honeycomb, to memory his message came, and errand too. In daring do and glamoury he had forgot them, journeying and turning, a wanderer. So now he must depart again and start again his gondola, though never still a messenger, a passenger, a terrier, a roving as a feather does. Lost